The longer-rated Pyro Archon is coming next week, and there's already a lot of division regarding her kit. Some people think she's the best thing since sliced bread, and some are very disappointed with her. But with her early access finally here, we can now theorycraft Mavuika and see how good or not she actually is. There's a lot to unpack here, so you may want to grab some snacks as this is going to be a long video. And just a disclaimer, but please keep in mind this is pre-release. There could be new things discovered or even some things changed by the time Mavuika is actually out. Let's get started. Alright, so you probably know the gist of Mavuika's kit by now, but to make sure we are all on the same page, I'll summarize. Mavuika's kit is designed to allow her to function as either an on-field DPS or an off-field sub-DPS. This is because her skill has two modes. Either mode will put her into a Night Soul Blessing state with 80 Night Soul points, and the tap skill summons a ring that deals AoE pyro damage every 2 seconds over a 12-second duration, while the hold skill will cause her to mount her motorcycle, in which she gains enhanced normal and charged attacks that deal pyro damage by whacking the enemies with her bike, and while she is on the bike, the ring from her tap skill will not be present, and vice versa, so you have to pick between one playstyle or the other. Note that while Mavuika is on her bike, for her combo you'll always want to do her charged attack and not normal attacks, as the charged attack has a much higher multiplier and is a massive circular AoE, so there's no reason not to be charged attacking. And then one of the most important parts of Mavuika's kit is going to be her burst. This is unique because it doesn't cost energy. Instead, it uses a new mechanic called Fighting Spirit, which is fueled by any party member consuming Night Soul points, or by hitting them with normal attacks, but consuming Night Soul is far more efficient for this. And Mavrika needs at least 100 Fighting Spirit to be able to cast her burst, but she can reach up to 200, and you want to get as close to 200 as possible. This is because, in addition to the burst dealing massive AoE pyro damage on cast, it also puts Mavrika into her hold E DPS state for 7 seconds, while giving her a lot of extra attack scaling on her normal charged attacks, as well as the burst cast damage itself, making them all do substantially more damage. On top of that, Mavrika's Ascension Far passive also provides a damage bonus buff to your active character after Mavrika uses her burst, which will be equal to 20% of the fighting spirit consumed, so 40% at most. That is a good amount of damage bonus. It's around what Farina averages with her fanfare when using a single target healer like Bennett. However, in contrast with Farina's buff, Mavuika's goes down every second for a full 20 seconds until it reaches 0, making the averaged buff size lower than Farina's even with a single target healer. And that's essentially what you need to know about how Mavuika's kit works. As a support sub-DPS, she can provide 12 seconds of AoE Pyro every 2 seconds, a large nuke with her burst cast, and decent but not crazy amount of damage bonus buffing. In addition to her own buff, Mavrika uses Night Soul, so she is capable of buffing farther with the scroll set, although most of the time there will already be another natlan support on their team using that set already anyway. And as an on-field DPS, Mavrika has extremely high scalings while being Pyro to take advantage of Vaporize or Melt, and having infinite interruption resistance during her burst and massive AoE on her charged attacks. And with that, we understand the basics of Mavrika's kit, and we can now look into her teams and how to build her. Since she has two playstyles, this will be split between them both. I'll be starting with her on-field playstyle, as her kit seems to be primarily focused on that. As mentioned, Mavrika really wants teammates that consume Night Soul points. She does have Night Soul points of her own with her skill, but she doesn't actually consume them during her burst, so as a DPS, Mavrika will only consume a few Night Soul during the rotation setup. Thus, you will need a natlan support unit to help fuel her burst. Because of this, I've seen many people say that Shilonen is basically required for Mavrika to function as a DPS, as Shilonen is the only one that can instantaneously consume a high amount of Night Soul. This, along with Shilonen's resistance trait itself being fantastic, does make her an excellent option for Mavuika, usually going to be best in slot on most if not all of her teams, but it doesn't make her the only option. Seatlali and Araran are also fantastic support options. They consume a similar amount of Night Soul as Shilonen throughout a full rotation, while being able to reliably buff Mavuika with the scroll set, just like Shilonen, and also providing good utility of their own as well. For Seedlali's utility, she provides 20% resistance shred while applying AoE Cryo that can enable Mavuika's teams to melt, and can also buff with either Thrilling Tales or her own signature weapon. She also provides a shield, although that doesn't really matter since Mavuika has infinite poise anyway. And Uraran can provide 30% attack with his C6 while doing some solid AoE damage of his own, although Mavuika does so much damage that you probably won't really notice his. You'll always want at least one of these three supports on the team. Seelonen should definitely be part of Mavuika's strongest team, but as long as you do have Seat Lali or Auroron to use instead, you'll still be able to make a strong Mavuika team. That explained, let's look into those teams. Since Mavrika does have these extremely high multipliers, especially on the cast of her burst, she works fantastic in Vaporize and Melt teams. For Vaporize, a team such as Mavrika, Shilonen, Farina, Bennett will work exceptionally well. Mavrika's Pyro application is not very fast, so Farina should be enough as solo Hydro for her to Vaporize, although that does need to be tested again on post-release. But being able to use Farina as solo Hydro is very nice, since Mavrika doesn't want to perform normal attacks, which would be needed to drive someone like Yelan. And note that the numbers in my calcs here assume that Mavrika's charged attack hits 9 total times during the spin, then 1 final time for the slam, and gets a total of 4 instances of Vaporize. As you can see from the numbers, this team should be absurdly powerful. Mavrika's personal damage alone is nearly 2 million here, the highest of any character in the entire game. That's with an estimated only 10 seconds of fill time while having massive AoE. This will definitely be one of Mavrika's strongest teams, if not the strongest. Auroron can be used instead of Shilon in here. He applies Electro, which does not interfere with Vaporize. It can actually help ensure that a slower application like Farina's is sufficient. I don't think Mavrika will need that, but it could still be a nice bit of consistency improvement. That aside, Mavrika's damage is lower with Auroron than Shilonen since he doesn't have Resistance Shred, but his personal damage, if built decently enough, can make up for it, at least enough for him to be a good 4-star alternative to Shilonen here. And while we are talking about Auroron, one nice thing he does is enable Mavuika to be used in a Chevres overload team, such as Mavuika, Auroron, Bennett, Chevres. While Auroron is designed with Electrocharged in mind, he also works well with Night Soul aligned damage as well, which Mavuika deals, so he'll be able to work here. Since there's no Vaporize or Melt to take advantage of that huge multiplier on Mavrika's cast burst, the front-loaded damage is lower here compared to those teams, but as you can see from the calc, the overall damage in DPS is still very high, over 100,000 team DPS, definitely by far the strongest Chevres Overload team. And as mentioned earlier, Seedlali allows Mavrika Melt teams to be possible, so a team of Mavrika, Shilonen, Seedlali, Bennett will be very strong. Now, this is one team that will absolutely need to be tested during post-release, because I'm not confident on how many melts Mavrika will get on her charged attacks here before Pyro overtakes as the aura. But for these calcs, I assume that the only hits she melts are her cast burst damage and one charged attack. But even with just that, Mavrika is doing around the same damage and DPS as the Vape team, and in this team, Mavrika's melted burst is doing nearly 1 million damage, likely more, and the melt on the first charged attack is doing nearly 300,000. So with front load that high, I can definitely see this being her strongest team overall. You can use Kazuha or Sucrose instead of Shilonen if you don't have her available. You'll gain grouping, which can be useful depending on the chamber, but you will lose out on a lot of damage. Another melt variant I looked into was using a second cryo like Rosaria instead of Bennett, trading out Bennett's massive attack buff for melting the charged attacks, while gaining about 27% crit rate from Rosaria and Cryo Resonance. I didn't have high expectations for this, and it is a lot less DPS than Bennett, but Mavrika is so strong that this is still a very powerful team regardless. So if you are one of those people that don't like using Bennett for whatever reason, this may be the team for you. And those seem to be the primary teams for Mavuika as an on-field DPS. There will certainly be other teams you'll be able to use her in, but they'll likely be a lot less powerful than these. But with those on teams covered, we can now look into Mavrika's teams as an off-fielder. As mentioned, in this role, she's primarily providing AoE Pyro from off-field every 2 seconds over a 12-second duration, while providing a damage bonus buff, and being able to hold Scroll if nobody else on the team has it. And her burst still does high damage as a sub-DPS, although her damage will be much less in teams that can't vaporize or melt the burst. But with this in mind, the main teams that will be able to utilize Mavrika in this role are teams that want off-field pyro and that don't need it to be super fast, and can also fit in a natlan support to fuel the fighting spirit, or use a natlan DPS that can fuel it themselves. Starting with such natlan DPS, the one that gets the most obvious upgrade from Mavrika is Kinich. She'll be replacing Toma here, so it should go without saying why Mavrika is a huge upgrade. She allows Kinich to finally have the 4-piece scroll buff on his team without having to take Emily off of the team. Though you will want to ensure that you use Emily on deep woods since there won't be anyone else to use it. With Mavrika, Kinich now has extremely high personal damage, over 1.5 million, while having a very strong sub DPS in Emily, and further sub DPS damage from Mavrika as well. This makes him and his team absurdly powerful, reaching well over 100,000 DPS, very similar to Mavrika's own on-field teams can do. One caveat to keep in mind with this is that refreshing burning on enemies already affected by it does not actually count as triggering the reaction, so against a single wave of enemies, Mavrika will only be able to trigger the set effect once per rotation. As long as there is a second wave of enemies, this won't be an issue, and even against just a single wave, it shouldn't be that much of an issue, since if you do need a second rotation in this scenario, the enemies likely have low enough HP in that rotation for not having scroll there to not be that big of a concern. One more thing to note with Mavrika on Kenichi team is that the Pyro Traveler can actually provide very similar buffing to Mavrika for him. The Traveler will do less sub DPS damage than Mavrika, but they also take less fill time, so they may perform similar, if not better, than a C0 Mavrika, depending on your investment into Kinich and Emily, and the Traveler is a completely free unit. But I'll explore that more in my Pyro Traveler video, as well as in post-release when it can be compared more closely. Chaska is also set to get an upgrade with Mavrika. With Mavrika, double Feck teams should now be optimal for Chaska even at C0, with Chaska, Mavrika, Bennett, and either Seed Lali or Farina as the last slot. Both teams calc similar, but Seed Lali should be more ideal because she provides resistance shred, with Chaska otherwise has none of. You'll also melt Mavrika's burst. Getting that melt off on Mavrika's burst should be huge for Chaska, since that's a massive amount of AoE damage, which is something that Chaska normally lacks. And Mavrika will likely be able to wipe out an entire wave of enemies for Chaska with this. So, Mavrika makes Chaska yet another DPS that goes over that 100,000 team DPS threshold, while also helping to mitigate her AoE issues, and you even get a shield if using Seed Lali. And it should also come as no surprise that Mavrika is an upgrade for Mualani as well. AoE Pyro every 2 seconds is sufficient for Mualani, so she's now no longer tied to Zhongling's awful energy requirements, and now has a Pyro applier that actually buffs and does meaningful damage as well. However, since Mavrika applies Pyro so much slower than Zhongling, it will be difficult to use double Hydro without losing your Pyro aura, depending on the Hydro unit. But this should work out just fine if Mona is the Hydro. Using Mona's skill, she'll be cast early in the rotation for setup, and it will already be gone by the time Mualani takes the field, so it won't steal any Vaporize. And as long as you cast Mona's burst before Mavrika rather than right before Mualani, that won't steal any Vaporize either. The only issue with this is, the timing may be too tight for Mualani to get the Omen buff on her first Shark Bite, but you will get it on Mavrika's burst damage instead, which is fine. Plus, if Mona is C1, which I have assumed for this calc, she'll also buff Vaporize damage for the whole team across the full rotation, which increases Mualani's damage by about 10%, even without her getting the Omen. There are other options than Mona for the last slot, and the best alternatives seem to be Chiari, Kazuha, or Zhongli. Of these options, Chiari results in the most DPS on sheet, thanks to her high damage with less than a second of fill time. I also looked into using Seed Lolly here, but I didn't like it at all. Assuming it actually works, it's not actually better than the other options. If Seed Lolly ever applies Cryo before Mavuika applies Pyro, which seems likely to happen, you'll end up having Mualani trigger Freeze instead of Vaporize. So this is something that will need to be tested in post-release to see if it works, but even if it does work, it's not actually better than the other options, and they don't have the same risks. But overall, for Mualani, Mavrika is giving her a sizely upgrade to Xiangling, while also not having to worry about the energy anymore, so it's a huge all-around improvement. And moving on to non-Natlan DPS, I looked into both Risley and Ganyu for Melt DPS teams. For both of them, the team is Mavrika, Shilon, and Bennett, and they both do get an upgrade with this compared to their current strongest teams. It's not a very large upgrade by any means, but still an upgrade nonetheless. In Risley's case, having a pure melt team rather than vape melt as his strongest team is pretty nice because in his team with Farina and Xiangling, though it doesn't happen often, Farina can still melt from Risley. That could be a problem with a C1 Risley if she happens to steal a melt from a charged attack. But with the Mafrika Shilona team, you don't have to worry about that anymore. And with Ganyu, for Mafrika to be an upgrade over Kazuha here, I am assuming that you can perform and melt 5 charged shots, with the 5th not being Bennett buffed. If the 5th doesn't melt, then this won't actually be better than Kazuha, but as long as it does, this will be a modest upgrade for Ganyu. Another team archetype Mafrika will work well in as an off-fielder is Chevrolet Overload teams with an Electro on-field DPS. I specify an Electro on-fielder because for a Pyro DPS overload team, there's not actually any room to fit in another Pyro support unless you replace Bennett, which you don't want to do. But with Electro on-fielders, previously they had a dilemma in overload teams where they had to use either Bennett for his buffing but lose out on multi-rave resistant shred from Chevrolet, or use an off-field applier like Xiangling, but then miss out on the buffing from Bennett. Mavrika bridges this gap by being both a buffer and off-field applier at the same time. For Clorant, a team of Mavrika, Chevrolet, Ururan is a very good upgrade over current options for our Overload team, as you actually get more damage on Clorant than what you would with Bennett here, while having Mavrika do similar, if not more damage than what Xiangling would be doing, and not confining you to a 20-second rotation either. This is Clorant's new strongest team, ahead of even her new Taser team with Araran, Farina, and Kazuha, although it is pretty close. Sino Overload also got a sizable upgrade with Mavrika as well. Just like with Clorant, Mavrika is doing more damage than Glingwood here, while buffing and allowing the use of Araran instead of Fischl. One unfortunate thing with this though is, since Mavrika's Pyro application is much slower than the Electro application on the team, she will be the one triggering Overload instead of Sino, so his Elemental Mastery buffs and scalings are still going to waste here. Thus, this is ultimately still not better than his Quick Bloom team, but Overload Sino is at the very least much less of a meme team now. It's actually close enough to his Quick Bloom team to where if you have Constellations on Sino, it might actually do better. Now, unfortunately, Raiden Overload did not get a buff from Mavrika. This is caused by direct anti-synergy with their kits. Mavrika's burst does not use energy at all, so she does not contribute to Raiden's resolve. On top of that, while being able to use Auron is a good thing for Clorant and Sino, needing to use him is bad for Raiden, because it means she has no room to use Kujo Sara, thus less buffing and less resolve, as the only resolve here is coming from Auron and Chevrolet with their 60 cost bursts. So overall, this is actually a downgrade to Raiden's current Overload teams. I also looked into using Mavrika with Nuvolette, Mavrika, Shilonen, and then either Farina or Kazuha. Mavrika would be used in place of one of them. It seems to be about the same power level regardless of which, though if Nuvolette is C1, you'll definitely want Farina and not Kazuha. The overall idea with Mavrika on Nuvolette's team is simply using her as a sub DPS, vaporizing hard damage off of Nuvolette's Hydra application. Having her instead of Kazuha can be nice, because you only have to swap to her once in the rotation, whereas with Kazuha you have to worry about managing VV uptime, especially in multi-wave. Overall, this is a good option for Neuvillette, although it is not an upgrade over his current best teams, but still having a new option is nice for some variety. Navia is a DPS that should be slated to use Mavuika quite well, being used in place of Farina here. Mavuika won't provide as much buffing as Farina, but it's honestly not too much lower since you get both Pyro Resonance and Mavuika's damage bonus. Mavuika also does a bit more damage than Farina here, but what really makes this an upgrade over Farina is you can do a shorter rotation. There's no need to use Shilone's Burst since it's not building any fanfare without Farina, and Bennett can also skip his skill in most rotations, since Mavrika can funnel 5 particles to him, and she doesn't need any particles from him since she doesn't use energy anyway. So assuming you can rotate 4 seconds faster with Mavrika here instead of Farina, this is a very nice upgrade for Navia, and she now has a full premium team. Linny is another DPS that should be getting an upgrade with Mavrika, with a team of Linny, Mavrika, Seatlali, Bennett. Essentially, what this team does is utilize Seatlali's cryo application to melt Mavrika's burst for massive damage, then get Pyro Aura applied after, allowing Linny to get 100 damage bonus buff for playing a triple Pyro team. The setup takes quite a bit of Bennett uptime, but even assuming Linny only performs 3 charge shots, with the third one and not getting Bennett's buff, this still looks to be a lot stronger than his forward vaporized teams. But this will be far easier to play than those vaporized teams, since there's no Hydro Aura to manage, and you also have a shield, which is of great value for Lenny since he has low poise while doing his charge shots. And one more character I looked into using Mavuika with is Wanderer. Unfortunately, there aren't any natlan support units he works with to provide Fighting Spirit to Mavuika, but you do get 1.5 Fighting Spirit for every normal attack, of which Wanderer performs a lot of, so he can still use Mavuika. Compared to Farina, Mavuika won't buff Wanderer's damage by as much, but her personal damage is a bit higher than Farina's, and since you can skip Bennett's skill, the rotation will be faster. However, you do want to use Mavrika's burst during Bennett's buff to maximize her damage, and if you do, Wanderer may not get Bennett buff on his burst at the end of his fill time, unless you either cut his combo a bit short at the end, or use Echoes instead of DPC as his set, so that you don't need to perform the charged attack at the start, thus lowering his fill time. Doing it in either of these ways should result in just a bit less team DPS than Farina, so Mavrika looks like she should be a good side grade for him. One thing to keep in mind is that if you have a C6 Wanderer, Echoes is already as good, if not better, than DPC on him anyway, so there won't actually be a trade-off by using it. And Wanderer will also have way more normal attack hits, performing enough to build more than 90 Fighting Spirit from Mavrika all by himself. So for C6 Wanderer, Mavrika may actually be an upgrade. But those were all the units Mavrika seems like she'll be worthwhile with as an off-fielder. So now that we know her teams for both playstyles, for Mavrika's artifacts as an on-fielder, you'll want to use either EM or Attack Sense, Pyro Goblet, and Crit Circlet. EM is about 7% better than Attack if you're playing a Vaporized team, so you'll want to try and get a good EM sense if you can, but Attack can be used if you can't get one. If you're playing the Melt team where you just melt Mavrika's burst in one charged attack, Attack sense is actually slightly higher for Mavrika's overall damage, but EM is a lot higher for that front-loaded melt damage, so it'll likely still be better in practice. And if you're using a team that doesn't react at all, such as an Overload team, then you'll of course stick with Attack. For off-field Mavrika, if it's a team where she is melting or vaping her burst, you'll want an EM Sans. Although if Bennett isn't on the team, attack will be pretty close, if not better. And for substats, it will be the usual, prioritizing crit, attack, and EM. One thing of note is you don't need to worry about energy recharge substats on Mavrika at all, because the stat doesn't actually do anything on her. And that's nice because it means we can skip the usual energy requirements part of the video. And for the artifact sets, with on-field Mavuika, something you may have heard is that she doesn't get full uptime on Obsidian Codex, since she's not actually consuming Night Soul while her burst is active. And that does seem to be true, but it's really not that big of a deal, Mavrika's damage is highly front-loaded, so by the time the crit rate from Codex expires, she's already dealt most of her damage. So, Codex is her strongest DPS set by far. Marechaussee Hunter can be used as an alternative if you're using Farina. Crimson Witch and Gilded Dreams are usable for Vape and Melt teams, but all three of these sets are a lot worse than Obsidian Codex, so you do want to get that set. And for off-field Mavuika, you'll always use 4-piece scroll if nobody else on the team has it, but a lot of the times there will already be a scroll holder, so if there is, you'll just use Codex. And then for Mavuika's weapons, I calculated them with her on-field, but these weapons should all rank relative to each other, mostly the same for off-field as well. Her signature weapon, 1,000 Blazing Suns, is absolutely incredible and her best in slot by far. If you can't get it, the next best bet will be the 5-star stat stick Claymore that you have, or an R5 Serpent Spine. Mailed Flower and Tidal Shadow seem to be her best free-to-play options, though Mailed Flower is only if you are getting Vape or Melt, and Tidal Shadow requires you to reliably get healed in a timely fashion every rotation, though that won't be an issue if you're using Shilonen and make sure you cast her Burst. Lastly, we can look at Mavrika's Constellations. Her C1 does quite a lot, increases her maximum Night Cell from 80 to 120, which essentially means her off-field skill lasts 18 seconds now instead of 12, and that shall contribute more towards her own fighting spirit in her off-field playstyle. On that same note, the amount of fighting spirit she gains by any means is now increased by 25% from this constellation, so pretty much any team she's used in will be reaching the 200 maximum now. And on top of that, Mavrika also gets 40 extra attack percent to herself for a nice personal damage increase. This is overall a very good increase to Mavrika's damage, around 20%. The longer lasting pyro application can be good for her support as well. Mavrika's C2 is also incredible. For both her on-field and off-field playstyle, she'll gain 200 base attack. She'll also gain a lot of extra attack scaling on her normal charged attacks as well as her burst. And for her off-field playstyle, while the ring from her skill is present, it will decrease the defense of nearby enemies by 20%, thus giving her some extra buffing. For on-field Mavrika, this is an absurd 32% increase to her damage, and for off-field, it's about a 20% increase, although the defense strat will also increase the rest of the team's damage by around 12%. C3 will increase her burst by 3 levels, which is a good increase. Nothing crazy for her overall damage, but it will be crazy for how much it improves her front-loaded burst damage by. C4 improves her buffing by causing her damage bonus buff to increase by a further 10% and no longer decay, so it's now essentially a 20-second long 50 damage bonus buff. This is alright, but again, nothing crazy for a high constellation. C5 increases her skill by 3 levels. Again, it's good, but nothing crazy. Then C6 is something crazy. Mavrika will now gain the 20% defense shred from her C2, even if she's on field, and she'll also gain different coordinated attacks depending on if she's on or off field, which deal a lot of damage. Overall, Mavrika has a very strong C1 and C2, and like usual with the Archons, C2 is the ideal stopping point. There's not much point going beyond C2 unless you intend to get C6 over time, but you'd likely get better returns on your Primogem investment by investing into your supports like Farina and Seat Lally at that point. And that covers just about everything. To recap, as an on-field DPS, Mavrika is looking to have the highest personal damage in the entire game, with a large portion of it being front-loaded. And on top of that, she has great AoE and can't be interrupted during her DPS window. One of her main caveats will be that she is heavily reliant on having a natlan support unit to fuel her burst. Another caveat could be a bit of an issue in some situations, that she's a melee range DPS that uses Bennett, so in some scenarios where his circle impact is problematic, she may not feel quite as strong as some characters like Nublet and Mualani that don't have this issue. And Mavrika's burst also only lasts 7 seconds, so any amount of time that you have to spend moving over to a new wave of enemies will be a lot of damage lost. Still, Mavrika is so strong that this is a reasonable caveat to come with the level of power. As an off-fielder, Mavuika primarily seems to be an upgrade for Kinich, Mualani, Chaska, Lini, Navia, Risley, Ganyu, and Clarant, while being a side grade or slight downgrade to current options for Neuvillette and Wanderer. For Lini, Navia, Chaska, and Mualani, Mavrika is a very nice upgrade, although with Kinich, I do want to reiterate that I don't think Mavrika is actually much better than the Pyro Traveler for him, but we will go over that more in the Traveler video. For Risley and Ganyu, they do get a decent increase, but it doesn't really move the needle for them and their place in the meta much at all. I have seen that a lot of people are unhappy with Mavrika's supportive capabilities, and it's understandable why. In Fontaine, we had Farina, and she was designed in a way that made her great for almost every team in the game, whereas for Mavrika to upgrade teams, she's essentially locked either to natlan DPS or DPS that already use a natlan support like Shilonen, while still having room to fit Mavrika in. Pyro is a less universally good element as Hydro, so expecting Mavrika to have that same universal support capability as Farina was probably not realistic, but even still, it feels like she could have been designed much better regarding this. But even though Mavrika isn't what a lot of people wanted, including myself, she is still a very powerful character, likely the strongest DPS in the game. Their value may continue to increase as we get new natlan units over time. And if you liked today's video, please be sure to give a like and subscribe and comment down below. Also, feel free to join my Discord, link in the pinned comment. Thanks and goodbye.